Hello, everyone, and welcome you to episode 6 of ECS3701, Monetary Economics, and we are taking it exactly from where we left it in our last and previous meeting. If you still remember, the last discussion that we had, we were focusing on the tactics of choosing the monetary policy instrument, and we discussed all these aspects. And we ended by looking at the tools of the monetary policy, tools of the central bank, and how they impact on the policy instruments and on the intermediate targets, ultimately on the goals. So just to do a recap of the previous slide, this is where we were and this is what we covered last. So in the same spirit, today we are going to move on and look at a new topic, which is Learning Unit 20. It looks at the quantity theory of money. So if this equation is quite interesting, there's a bit of mathematics, but of course you are not required to prove all those mathematical formulations, but you just have to understand how the equation works, and then from there you are able to derive some implications or applications to the South African economy. So let's start with the quantity theory of money, where we are saying that the quantity theory of money is a theory of how the nominal value of aggregate income is determined. So we are looking at nominal value of aggregate income. By aggregate income, we are referring to remember we have real income and nominal income. So nominal income is just the multiplication or the product of total amount of goods produced in the economy multiplied by the current prices. But if you're calculating real income, we are looking at the current production multiplied by the base year prices. I hope you have done this in your intermediate macroeconomics. So it's an equation that simply connects, it simply tells us how nominal income can be determined in the economy. So because it also tells us how much money is held for a given amount of aggregate income, it is also referred to as the theory of the demand for money. So it's two in one. Number one, it determines how the nominal value of aggregate income is determined. Two, it also tells us how much money is held at a given amount of aggregate income, which is also, in other words, the theory of the demand for money. So the most important feature of this theory is that it suggests that interest rates have no effect on the demand for money. So when I'm looking at this quantity theory of money, one thing that you need to note is that the quantity theory of money states or suggests that interest rates have no effect on the demand for money. And when you are looking now at the other theories of demand for money, like why do people demand money, you'd see that there are other theories like the liquidity preference theory that subscribe to the idea that interest rates do have an impact on the quantity demanded of money. But let's look at this theory in more detail. So you can see that we would start with the velocity of money and the equation of exchange. So this equation that we are going to analyze in this section, it was developed by Ivan Fisher. So Fisher wanted to examine the link between the total quantity of money, which is M, which is what we tell money supply, and the total amount of spending on final goods and services that are produced in the economy, P times Y. So if you look at P times Y, this is the nominal income because we are multiplying total production, Y multiplied by the price level, and we get our nominal amount of income, or we are talking about nominal income, or remember income is the same as spending. So total amount of spending, this is the amount of expenditure in the economy because you are simply multiplying the price level by the total amount of output, where P is the price level and Y is the aggregate output or income. Okay, so total spending P times Y is also thought of as the aggregate nominal income for the economy, or as nominal GDP. If you remember what I've just said, and from the circular flow of income, what is earned by someone is another person's expenditure. Therefore, total spending, this product is the same as nominal income or aggregate income for the economy, or in other words, technically, it's the nominal GDP. I hope this is clear at the moment. If you have any question, don't hesitate to ask as we progress. So the concept that provides the link between M and P times Y is called the velocity of money, often reduced to velocity. So when you're talking about velocity, we are simply looking at the speed at which money exchanges hands from one person to the next person. So what is that V, or what is that velocity of circulation? The average number of times per year, which is turnover, that a rand is spent buying the goods and services produced in the economy. So we compute this V, or this velocity of circulation, as the rate at which money is changing hands in the economy. So you can look at this, in other words, by the number of times a unit of a rand has been spent in buying total amount of goods that is produced in the economy. So the velocity V is defined more precisely as the total spending PY divided by the quantity of money that we have in the economy. So if you want to calculate velocity of circulation, we simply divide the total value of goods and services in the economy by the amount of money that we have. So simplified, we can say V is equals to, let's say we have 10 billion as our output, divided by 2 billion as in the amount of money that we have in the economy. Then this is also 10 billion. Okay, it's billion. So we are saying 10 billion divided by 2 billion, we can get something like probably 5. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's 5. So it means that a same unit of a rand is exchanged 5 times, it has been spent 5 times in the entire year in buying goods and services. So this is what we are referring to as the velocity of circulation. How much, or the rate at which money is exchanging hands. In other words, we are looking at the average number of times per year, which is turnover, that a rand has been spent in buying total amount of goods and services. So this is the formula for computing your velocity of circulation. So those of you who are doing economics as this module and are doing economics as a program or as a degree, you should take note of how this equation has been presented, because you might also encounter it when you're doing econometrics. So it's quite important. So by multiplying both sides of this definition by M, it means multiplied by M this side and then multiplied by M this side, we obtain the equation of exchange. So from this velocity of money computation here, when we cross multiply by M, it means that we will come up with the equation of exchange. So this equation of exchange simply it relates nominal income. What is our nominal income? It is PY to the quantity of money and velocity. So when we multiply M by V, we have the nominal income, which is the price of the goods and services multiplied by the number, you can call it aggregate output, right? So we multiply this and we come up with our nominal income or nominal GDP. So the equation of exchange, which is this one now, thus says that the quantity of money multiplied by the number of times that money is spent in a given year gives us nominal income. So we are multiplying the value of money, the amount of money that we have, multiplied by the number of times that money is spent in a given year. We are going to come up with the total that we are referring to as nominal income. So equation 2, by equation 2, I forgot to just indicate that this is our equation 2. So equation 2 is nothing more than an identity, which is a relationship that is true by definition. It does not tell us, for instance, it doesn't tell us, for instance, that when the money supply M changes, nominal income P times Y changes in the same direction. So it's just an identity, but at the moment we don't know how M is related to PY or how price is impacted by the left-hand side. But that's what we are going to see in the following slides. So in doing that, let's look at the demand for money. But we are just looking at the Fisher's quantity theory or Fisher's quantity equation, quantity of money equation, in a different angle, through a different lens. So we are saying another way of interpreting the Fisher's equation theory is in terms of the demand for money, the quantity of money that people want to hold. Remember, demand for money, we're just saying the amount of money that people are willing to hold, okay, as cash. So because the quantity theory of money tells us how much money is held for a given amount of nominal spending, it is in fact a theory of the demand for money. And it is quite interesting, as we are going to see when we are comparing this theory, Fisher's equation, and Keynes' theory of demand for money. It will be interesting to have a look at that. But generally, we are saying also this Fisher's quantity theory, also it is a representation of the demand for money. Why? Because if we reformulate this, you can see that we can have M being equal to 1 over V multiplied by PY. Let's have some mathematical manipulations, but I know you are very conversant with this. So we are having MV being equal to PY, but we can divide both sides by V, which means M will be equal to 1 over V multiplied by PY. So this is the same, just like saying PY over V. 1 over V. We are just doing this for a reason, because we still want to convert this 1 over V into another coefficient again. So it's not something that you can worry about at the moment, because we are getting them. So this is our demand for money. This is the amount of money that the economy is willing to hold at any given time in a particular year. So that being said, when the money market is in equilibrium, money supply equals to money demand. So we can relate M in the equation by MD. So in actual sense, if this is our money supply in the economy, and in equilibrium, we know that money supply is exactly the same as money demand. So we can substitute this M and convert it into MD, because at equilibrium, money supply is exactly the same as money demand. So the velocity is assumed to be a constant, okay? And we can okay. I think there's a problem here. Velocity is assumed to be constant. We can replace 1 over V with a constant K. So which means whenever there is 1 over V here, we can replace with a constant K. So what does it mean now? It would mean that we have replaced M with MD and K with 1 over V. Therefore, the implication is that money demand in an economy, according to Fisher, is equals to K multiplied by PY. So therefore, Fisher's theory suggests that the demand for money is purely a function of income, and interest rates have no impact on the demand for money. So according to Fisher, because this demand for money theory, it falls under the classical school of thought, because they believed that no interest rates can have an impact on the demand for money. Demand for money is entirely determined by the determined by the income of the economy. So if we want to put it further, you can also see that if income increases in the economy, money demand will also go up. If price level increases in the economy, the demand for money also increases, right? But then we are still migrating and moving on deeper and deeper. So from the equation of exchange to the quantity theory of money. So we are now moving from the equation of exchange to the quantity theory of money. So if you have noted the difference between the equation of exchange, I will show you the difference between the equation of exchange, which is what we have here, and where we want to go, which is the quantity theory of money. We are going to see how we get there. But Fisher's view that velocity is fairly constant in the short run such that V is equals to V bar. Whenever, in most cases in economics, if you see that we put a bar, it means that that variable is assumed to be constant in general. So in this case, we are assuming that according to Fisher, this velocity is fairly constant in the short run, such that V is equals to V bar. So this view by Fisher, that velocity is fairly constant in the short run, such that V is equals to V bar, transforms the equation of exchange into the theory, the quantity theory of money. So the main transformation here from the equation of exchange to the quantity theory of money comes because of the assumption that the velocity of circulation is constant in the short run. So, okay, so there are a lot of statements here, but it's only that I'm explaining in between, so we might end up losing the direction of our sentences, but let's continue together. So Fisher's view that velocity is fairly constant in the short run, so that V is equal to V bar, transforms the equation of exchange into the quantity theory of money, which states that nominal income, which is spending, is determined solely by movements in the quantity of money. What we are simply saying here is that since we have already assumed that V is constant, so which means V is not changing over time. So if anything that changes, this right-hand side would come or emanate from the quantity of money, which is money supply here. I hope this is clear, because we have assumed that this is constant. And since this is an identity or an equation, if there is a change in this side, or if there's a change in this, there should be a proportionate change again on the left-hand side. So the quantity theory of money simply states that nominal income, which is our spending, is determined solely by movements in the quantity theory of money. So the quantity theory of money equation above indicates that when the quantity theory of money M doubles, M multiplied by V bar doubles, and so must our P multiplied by Y, which is the value of nominal income. This is just what I was saying when I was explaining this bullet. The idea is that if M doubles, and we are assuming that this V is constant, so if M doubles, it means that M multiplied by V also doubles, and so does our nominal income, which is our P multiplied by Y. So the quantity theory and the price level, simply here, it's not a problem. I didn't include this because I knew you guys are good in mathematics. When now we want to determine P, you simply make it the subject of formula, which implies that if we are having P Y being equal to MV, what would be our P? P would be equal to MV over Y. Correct me if I'm wrong. This would be our price level. So to obtain price level based on this quantity theory of money, you simply divide both sides by Y, and then you know that your P is equals to MV divided by Y. So we are just linking the money supply and the price level. So if you want to understand this better, you can also see from what I have presented in our equation here that normally it is assumed that, okay, just hold on a bit. Okay, so normally it is assumed that output in the short run, it is also constant. So changes in the prices are directly linked to changes in money supply. That's why we'll find out that in an economy, if you increase money supply more than the rate at which output is growing, if we assume that output is growing, there will be equivalent changes in the prices as well. But let's not assume at the moment that output is fixed. No, let's let's continue with the assumption that output is variable. So you shall see as we go that if money supply increases at a lower growth rate compared to the growth in output, prices would grow at a lower rate. Otherwise, prices would go down. But if you find out that the money supply growth rate is greater than the growth rate of the economy, then inflation is likely to occur. I hope this is clear. But let's not jump ahead of ourselves. So changes in the quantity of money lead to proportionate changes in the price level. This is what I was just indicating in our previous illustration. So let's look at the quantity theory and inflation. So we now transform the quantity theory of money into a theory of inflation. So if you see a question that asks you about the theory of inflation, remember that we are not looking at the quantity theory of money. We have already transformed, we have already moved, we have already migrated from the quantity theory of money, and now we are looking at the theory of inflation. But before we go there, because the theory of inflation is what we have here, or finally what we have here, but here we are simply providing some illustrations that can help us to understand where we are coming from. We understand that percentage change in X multiplied by Y is the same as percentage change in X plus percentage change in Y. This is mathematically proven. If you want to calculate the percentage change in a product of two variables, you simply add respective percentage changes in those variables. Okay, so that being the case, the implication is that using this mathematical effect, we can rewrite the equation of exchange as follows: percentage change in M plus percentage change in V is equals to percentage change in P plus percentage change in Y. I hope this is clear, because we've simply noted that if we have assumed that this is your M and this is your V, which means if you want to get the percentage change in MV, you are simply adding the respective percentage changes for M and V. This is what we have done here. Percentage change in M plus percentage change in V is equals to percentage change in P plus percentage change in Y. So subtracting percentage change in Y from both sides of the preceding equation and recognizing that inflation rate pi is the growth rate of the price level, that is percentage change in P. Remember, inflation is regarded as the percentage change in prices. So we can replace percentage change in P by pi, which is inflation. We can come up with a formula that says inflation is equals to percentage change in P, which is equals to change in M plus change in V minus change in Y. But we have noted that the velocity of circulation is constant in the short run. So we can say percentage change in V is equals to 0 and eliminate the percentage change in V. Finally, we'll come up with percentage change in, actually inflation is equals to percentage change in M minus percentage change in Y. So this is where we wanted to get to. So you may forget about everything here and just note this formula if you don't like mathematics too much. But if you are happy with mathematics, you can also remind yourself by proving all this and then come here. But in the examination, what we are interested in is this equation. But we have done this so that you see where it came from. So in the examination, you might also be given maybe an assumption to say the percentage change in money supply was equal to 5%, and the percentage change in output, which is Y, was given by 2%. Are you able to compute the inflation rate that we can expect in this case? Obviously, it's 5 minus 2, and you get your 3%. What if percentage change in inflation, percentage change in money supply is 5%, and then percentage change in output is 10%. What would happen to inflation? Someone to intervene here. What would happen to inflation? Inflation will be equal to
-5.
-5%. And what does it mean if inflation is -5%? What does it mean if inflation is negative? In terms of prices, prices are going down. And technically, we call that deflation. There's a debate between deflation and disinflation. Okay, we're not going deep into that, but you just have to know that disinflation is the opposite of inflation. Deflation also can be termed the same, but they are different somehow. But at this level, we can assume that they are the same. But if you want to know more about the difference between the two, you can research and understand deflation and disinflation. And you can learn a lot about that. But generally, you must know this equation. So since we assume velocity is constant, its growth rate is 0. So the quantity theory of money is also the theory of inflation in this format. So the quantity theory of inflation indicates that inflation rate equals to the growth rate of money supply minus the growth rate of aggregate output. So I don't know if probably you can check the data for South Africa. You can check for last year and say what was the growth rate of money supply, you get the value. What was the growth rate of output, you get the value, and then you see if you are able to come up with the approximation for the inflation rate for South Africa for the previous year. So after looking at the Fisher's equation, not Fisherman, Ivan Fisher's equation, you can now have a comparison with the Keynesian theory of money demand. Remember we said the quantity theory of money is also a theory of money demand because it can tell us the amount of money that is needed in an economy at any given time. So it's equivalent to money demand. But the difference now is that Keynes abandoned the theory, the theoretical view that velocity was constant and developed a theory of demand and emphasized the importance of interest rate. Remember, the theory by Fisher did not take into account the impact of interest rates on the demand for money. Keynes now abandoned this quantity theory view. So he added other aspects like what you're going to see in this slide. So his theory was known as the liquidity preference theory. We did this, I'm sure, in Learning Unit 5, if you still remember, in which we briefly touched on it, but today we're going to explore the theory in a more detailed manner. So, according to Keynes, he presented 3 motives that are behind the demand for money. Number 1, it is transactions motive. There is precautionary motive, and there is also speculative motive. So we are going to touch on each of these motives to understand what really Keynes meant by each of these motives. Why do people demand money? According to Keynes, they demand money for transaction purposes, transaction motives. So these are motives for demanding money: precaution and then speculation. So number 1, we start with the transaction motives. Transaction motive. In the quantity theory approach, individuals are assumed to hold money because it is a medium of exchange and can be used to carry out everyday transactions. So this is according to the quantity theory of money. So Keynes initially accepted the quantity theory of money view that transactions components is proportional to income. So he was in support with what was being proposed by the quantity theory. So later, he and other economists recognized that new methods of payments referred to as payment technology would also affect the demand of money. Now, due to the rise of internet payments, internet banking, cell phone banking, people no longer demand money the same way they did in maybe 2000, the year 2000. People can now make payments over the internet. They can also make payments using cards. So the demand for cash or the demand for money is also affected by those things. But according to Keynes, the transaction motive for holding money is that people hold money for making day-to-day transactions. For example, you need transport money, you need food, you need entertainment, etc. So to meet all those needs, you need to have money, and therefore the motive behind your demand for money would be for transaction purposes. So here we are just looking now at how payment technology can have an impact on the demand for money. So, for example, credit cards enable consumers to make even very small purchases without needing to hold money. So, as payment technology advances, the demand for money would be like a decline. Would be likely to decline relative to income. So you can see that as technological advancement occur and people are now having better ways of making payments, people would not demand money as they would if there is no technology. So you can see how technology can have an impact on the demand for money. So that's the transactional motive. Then precaution. We are looking at Keynes also recognized that people hold money as a cushion against unexpected ones. Can someone give me an example of unexpected ones? Someone, a well-wisher who wants
to... Death is one of the examples.
Yes, thank you very much. Because even sickness, even what else that comes so unexpectedly, and that would need money. I don't know. Can we say what is this? What's the correct term for this? Maybe we assume that if your wife delivers at the hospital, can we say that is an unexpected one or an unexpected event? Okay, people don't want to discuss today. All right, so unexpected ones, they come in various forms and packages, but people need to be prepared for such events. So that's why we are saying precautionary motive. We are saying we are using money as a cushion against the occurrence of unexpected events or unexpected ones. The idea behind this is that people would set aside a certain proportion of their income. They would demand a certain proportion of their wealth as money so that they can meet all these precautionary all these unexpected ones. Someone dies in the family, there is need to be for the funeral to be taken care of, or someone is involved in an accident, something like that. There is need for money to facilitate all those unexpected ones. So we are saying Keynes argued that precautionary money balances, okay, I think we need to add something here because I don't think this sentence is making sense. Just hold on a bit. So we're saying Keynes argued that the precautionary money balances people want to hold would also be proportional. Okay, this one is correct. I think I was reading it incorrectly, but it's fine as it is. So we're saying Keynes argued the precautionary money balances people want to hold would also be proportional to income. So we just want you to think of some examples of the precautionary motive for the demand for money. We've already discussed about those examples. Something that you don't expect, but it will need you to pump out some cash. Then we also have the speculative motive. So Keynes also believed people choose to hold money as a store of wealth, which he called the speculative motive. A very good example of speculation is when someone buys the US dollar today with the anticipation that tomorrow its price is going to increase, then I sell it and make profit. That's speculation. So because the definition of money in Keynes analysis includes currency, which earns no interest, obviously if you're holding your cash or currency, it doesn't earn interest, and checking account deposits, which typically earn little interest. He assumed that money earns no interest and hence its opportunity cost relative to holding other assets such as bonds is the nominal interest rates on bonds, which is I. So what we are simply saying here, the concept that you need to get out of this is that if you decide to hold your wealth in terms of cash or in terms of currency, you are incurring an opportunity cost, because if you had deposited that money, you could have earned little interest. So we measure the opportunity cost of holding cash as the nominal interest rates on bonds, and we refer to that as I. Therefore, the implication is that as the interest rate I increases, the opportunity cost of money rises. It is more costly to hold money relative to bonds, and the quantity of money demanded falls. Is this clear? Because we are looking at the relationship between money demand and interest rates. So if interest rates on the market goes up, so now people realize that if I choose to continue holding my real cash balances, I'm losing in terms of the opportunity cost on the money that I could have earned had I invested this cash in a savings account or as a deposit. Right. I hope this is clear. And therefore, given such an aspect, we can now put the three motives together. And in putting the three motives for holding money balances together into a demand for money equation, Keynes was careful to distinguish between nominal quantities and the real quantities. So the idea that you learned in your intermediate macroeconomics about the distinction between real and nominal still is applicable in this case, because you need to understand real money balances and nominal money demand. Nominal demand for money and real demand for money. So he was very careful. So money is valued in terms of what it can buy. This is according to him, because if it doesn't make sense for you to have a lot of money, but it can't buy anything. So in other words, you don't have money. So we say you have money depending on the amount of goods and services that can be bought using the money that you have. So we are saying the money, in terms of measuring money is valued in terms of what it can buy. So in other words, if, for example, all prices in the economy double, the price level doubles, the same nominal quantity of money would only be able to buy half as many goods. That's clear, because, for instance, if you had 100 rands, and with that 100 rands, you can buy 5 loaves at 20 rand each. So now if the price levels doubles and then goes to another level, it increases by is it 100%? Yes, by 100%. It implies that now the amount of bread, the quantity of bread that you could buy would fall. You can buy half as many after a doubling of prices. So we're just having a look at the inflation rate, price levels, and demand for money. So you can see that there is a positive relationship between demand for money, nominal demand for money, and the price level. If price levels increase, you would need more money to buy the goods that you were buying previously. So Keynes thus reasoned that people want to hold a certain amount of real money balances, the quantity of money in real terms, not in nominal terms. So combining the three motives for holding money balances into a demand for real money balances led to what Keynes called the liquidity preference function, which is written as follows. MD is the demand for money, P is the price level. So if you are dividing money demand divided by P, we are getting real cash balances or real money balances, which is equal to the function of L, liquidity. I is our interest rate, Y is the income. So you can see that there's a positive relationship between real money balances and income. Further to that, there is also a negative relationship between money balances, real cash balances, and interest rates. And this is based on the idea that we have explained on the relationship between interest rate and money demand. So now if you want to find nominal money demand, not the real money demand, you simply multiply both sides by P. Now you get MD, which is nominal demand for money, and then you multiply everything by P. Here you get your nominal demand for money. But what you need to know is the relationship between price, the relation between interest rates and income. So the relation between interest rates, income, and money demand. Okay, so if you can see, compare this demand for money function, this demand function, and the one that was proposed by Fisher. You can see that the one that was proposed by Fisher was written as MD equals to K. Correct me if I'm still correct, if I'm still on the right track. Is this what we got using the Fisher equation? Anyone will still remember the Fisher equation or the quantity theory of money? Okay, let's move on. You can see that we can also add to this the portfolio theories of money demand, in which we are saying the theory of portfolio choice indicates that other factors besides income and nominal rates can also affect the demand for money, which includes your wealth, risk, and the liquidity of the other assets. And if you still remember quite well, we discussed in chapter 5 or learning unit 5 on the factors that affect the demand for an asset. We said wealth, positive relationship, risk, negative relationship, liquidity, positive relationship. So all this can be summed in this tabular format in which we are having the factors that determine the demand for money. We have interest rates. If interest rates increase, money demand falls due to the opportunity cost. Income, when someone's income increases, they demand more money because they want to make more transactions. Payment technology, if there is an increase in payment technology, less need for money in transactions. Wealth, positive relationship. Risk in other assets. So if the more riskier other assets become, people would migrate and move away from them and buy the particular asset under consideration. Then inflation, risk. If inflation increases, we can see that money relatively more risk, and so less desirable, because if there is an inflation in the economy, people would not want to hold much of their wealth in terms of money because they would lose when there is inflation. So liquidity of other assets. If the liquidity of other assets increases, what would happen to the demand for a particular asset? It would fall. Okay, so this is a summary, and you must know this, and it might help you as well. So after that, we are done with learning unit 20. And if you check in your textbook or in your study guide, some of the learning units are not relevant for this module. That's why I would see others are being skipped, and we move on to the most relevant ones that are applicable to our module and to the completion of this course. So as far as learning unit 20 is concerned, these are the most critical, important aspects that you need to master for you to succeed in this module. But it doesn't mean that you don't have to read further on your own. You must do research and read and understand, so that if a question comes, you don't struggle. Right. So let's move on to learning unit 24, which is what we want to finish off today's lesson on. Right. So let's look at this, the monetary policy theory. So we'll start with the response of monetary policy shocks. So as we saw in chapter 17, which is our learning unit 17 in this regard, the central goal of central banks is price stability, if you still remember. That is, they try to minimize or maintain inflation at a very, very low rate, close to a target level. Of course, you can't have inflation right at the target. That's why other nations have an inflation range, an inflation targeting range, in which you can say 3% to 6%, instead of saying we want to maintain inflation at 5%. But anyway, we want to have our inflation as closer as it can be to the inflation target, which is what we refer to as inflation target here. So the target level pi t here, remember in economics, inflation is represented by pi. That's the most appropriate way of representing it. So this pi t is our targeted inflation, which is what we are referring to as inflation target. So in an alternative way to think about how the central banks pursue price stability is that monetary policy should try to minimize the difference between inflation and the inflation target, which is what we are referring to as this deviation here. The deviation between the actual inflation and its target, which is what we refer to as inflation gap. So what is inflation gap? The difference between inflation and its target. So if you have targeted inflation to be 3% and you find yourself at 6%, the inflation gap will be 3%. So we have learned also that central banks can also care about stabilizing economic activity, right? So because economic activity can be sustained only at potential output, this objective of monetary policy can be described as saying that monetary policymakers want to have aggregate output close to its potential level, YP. So we have two aspects here, targeted output, or what we term here potential output, to be specific. Because remember, every economy has got a potential level of output that it can reach if everything goes well. But however, not all economies would manage to do that. That's why we find unemployment here in South Africa. It's because of the economy is not operating at its potential. So if it's not operating at its potential, then we have an output gap. The difference between South Africa's potential level of output and its current output. So another way of thinking or saying this is that central banks would want to minimize the difference between aggregate output and its potential output, Y minus YP. So Y is the actual output, YP is the potential level of output. So if you put this, we try to connect these two, you can see that we have output gap, at the same time we also have an inflation gap. So it will be sort of a contradiction when you are trying to close the inflation gap, you are also widening the output gap somehow. Let's see how that can be possible. But before we go there, let's look at the response of monetary policy to shocks. So these shocks can be supply shocks, they can be demand shocks. So there's a supply shock if the effects are targeting the supply side of the economy. For example, you can see that there is an increase in the oil prices in South Africa, international oil prices. That's a supply shock because oil prices affect the supply side of the economy. That's a supply shock. There are also demand shocks, but let's try and analyze first response to an aggregate demand shock. Okay, this might look quite intimidating, the diagram, but it's not, because I understand that you have covered some of these in your macroeconomics. Okay, so we begin by considering the effects of an aggregate demand shock, such as the disruption to the financial markets starting in August 2007, that increased financial frictions and caused both consumer and business spending to fall. So this is a demand shock because it affected aggregate demand. So the economy is initially operating at 1. Don't worry, I'm going to show you the diagram where output is at YP and inflation is at YT. So remember, YP is your potential level of output, full employment. Pi T is the targeted inflation rate. So the negative demand shock decreases aggregate demand. Okay, all right. Just hold on. I think. So we are saying, this is what we are saying here, that let's assume that the economy was operating at point number 1, where output is at its potential level and inflation is at its target level. Then the negative demand shock decreases aggregate demand, shifting aggregate demand 1 in figure 1 to the left to aggregate demand 2. Policymakers can respond to this shock in 2 possible ways. Number 1 is no response at all, which means we are saying no policy response, or they can come up with a policy stabilizes economic activity and inflation in the short run. So we can look at policies that are aiming at stabilizing economic activity and inflation in the short run. So these are the 2 ways in which the government can respond to that supply shock, that demand shock, I mean. no policy response, or you respond with policies that aim to stabilize economic activity and inflation in the short term. So let's look at this, the first policy response, which is not responding at all. This is what happens. We have our original demand curve. We have our original aggregate demand curve. Sorry, it's this one, the blue one, and original aggregate supply curve. So step number one is the aggregate demand curve shifts leftward following a demand shock that reduces aggregate demand. And when that happens, the new demand curve would intersect with the original supply curve at a lower level of output Y2. This is step number two, decreasing output and inflation until decreasing output and inflation, because this was where we were. This is where we were at point number one, and with YP and pi t, which is the target inflation rate and the potential level of output. But such a negative or an adverse shock would result in the economy operating below its potential. So the economy returns, no, we are not yet at number three. So now we are saying if the government does not respond in any way, there will be unemployment in the economy and a lot of resources will not be fully utilized, which would result in their prices falling and going down. Because remember, if there is anything, if there is too much of anything on the market, its price would go down. This includes raw materials, labor, capital, etc. All those that are used in the production processes. When there are too much on the market, a good example is if you are having too many teachers unemployed on the market, and then those teachers would also be willing even to take wage rates that are below the average, because they are too much on the market. So their price, which means the wage rate, will go down. So that also happens to other vectors of production. And the result would be an outward shift of the supply curve until a new equilibrium is established at point number three, where aggregate supply 3 is equivalent to aggregate demand 2 here, but at a lower level of inflation, but restoring the potential level of output. So step number 3, the economy returns to long-run equilibrium with inflation permanently reduced. This occurs when there is no policy response. So what is the first step? There is a demand shock, demand shifts inward, number 1. There is also, we are now below output because output decreases and inflation also, until the economy returns to long-run equilibrium with inflation permanently decreased. So this is a classical approach to restoring full equilibrium. This is in contrast with what the Keynesians would say. Let's see if there is a policy response. So this is the summary of what we have just said here. This is just the summary of what we have already discussed. And now, if there is policy stabilizes economic activity and inflation, policy stabilizes economic activity and inflation in the short run. So if there is a policy that stabilizes economic activity and inflation, what would happen? First, step number 1, there is an aggregate demand shock, which shifts the aggregate demand inwards from AD1 to AD2, establishing a new equilibrium at point number 2, which is below potential output and below targeted inflation. Now, this is step number 2, output and inflation falls. Step number 3, autonomous easing of monetary policy shifts the aggregate demand curve back to AD1, and the economy returns to long-run equilibrium with inflation stabilized at pi t. So the idea here is the difference between when there is no policy response and when there is policy response. With policy response, the economy would go back to equilibrium in a very, very faster way compared to leaving the markets to operate on themselves. You'll find out that unemployment might take even 30 years or 15 years to be restored, or for the economy to return back to its potential level of output. But the government might not wait and see. and look at the markets operating on themselves. That's what Keynes advocated for, that in the long run, we are all dead. So we can't wait for the markets to stabilize. The government must do something. They must intervene in the market. So that's why you see there are two opposing arrows here. The first arrow is the aggregate demand shock. Then this one is now the government stimulating the economy through quantitative easing or expansionary monetary policies. So aggregate demand shock policy stabilizes output and inflation in the short run. So we are simply saying here, an aggregate demand shock shifts the aggregate demand curve leftward from AD1 to AD2 and moves the economy from point 1 to point 2. You can also see point 1 to point 2, where aggregate output falls to Y2 and inflation falls from pi t to pi 2. An autonomous easing of monetary policy lowers real interest rates at any given inflation rate and shifts the aggregate demand curve back to AD1. Aggregate output returns to potential at point 1 and inflation returns to its targeted level. So that's output and inflation stabilization policies. Okay, I hope this is clear and you can all understand what's happening in this figure. So all economists have similar policy goals, that is to promote high employment and price stability, yet they often disagree on the best approach to achieving these goals. So suppose policymakers confront an economy that has high unemployment resulting from a negative demand or supply shock that has reduced aggregate output. We have two scenarios here that would occur. Non-activists believe wages and prices are very flexible, so the self-correcting mechanism is very rapid. When the non-activists, these are guys who believe in no government intervention. They say the government should not intervene in the market, should operate on its own, and wages and prices are very flexible. If there is unemployment in the economy, wages would quickly fall down, and then companies are able to hire more people into the output is also going to rise. This is the self-correcting mechanism, which is very rapid, according to the non-activist. They argue that the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift down, retaining the economy to full employment very quickly, and thus they believe government action is unnecessary to eliminate unemployment. We've seen this in terms of the diagram that was built for the no policy response. This is what happened following an aggregate demand shock. But the activists now, many of whom are followers of Keynes and are thus referred to as the Keynesians, regard the self-correcting mechanism through wage and price adjustment as very slow, because wages and prices are sticky. Actually, they are not only sticky, but they are sticky downwards. Okay, why do we say so? Because especially wage contracts, they are signed over a very long, short to medium or long term. For example, you see that a wage contract might span from 1 year to 5 years, or 1 year to 3 years, to say an employee would be getting this much of a wage rate. So whatever happens on the market, the employee might continue to receive the same wage rate, even when inflation is rising. So we cannot with certainty say that wages and prices are flexible. No, they are not flexible in the real world, because even prices, they are also sticky. Companies would have to change prices after a certain period of time, not like to have a self-correcting mechanism to say that prices and wages are very flexible. They are not. Okay, so as a result, they believe, who are these activists? They believe that it takes a very long time to reach the long run, agreeing with Keynes' famous adage that in the long run, we are all dead. So Keynes believed that let's not wait for the long run, because the long run, everyone will be dead. So the government must do something when there is unemployment, when output is falling short of the potential level of output. Right. So let's look at some lags and policy implementation. For those of you that are doing econometrics, you might find this interesting because when you're looking at lags, and as the example that I always give when teaching about lags, when you're looking at a lag, if we are in a room or a meeting and then one person cracks a joke now and all the people laugh at the same time except for one person who would laugh after 15 minutes for the same joke that had been cracked a long time ago, we can say that person is lagged because they respond with lags. So the same also principles are applicable, especially in policy implementation. You can increase money supply today and you find out that prices will not change. Output will not change today. It will not change this year. It will change 5 years to come or 3 years to come. That's a lag. So if policymakers could shift the aggregate demand curve instantaneously, activist policies could be used to immediately move the economy to the full employment level, as we have seen in the previous section. Right. So we are saying here, if policymakers are able to shift aggregate demand there and there, then it should not be a problem for South Africa to just say, okay, we have an unemployment rate of 30% here in South Africa. How much money supply should we increase in the economy so that the full employment level of outcome is reached? That should be very, very easy. But that's not the case now. However, several types of lags prevent this immediate shift from occurring. And there are differences in the length of these lags for monetary versus fiscal policy. The first lag that we should note as economists is the data lag, which is the time it takes for policymakers to obtain data indicating what's happening in the economy. Because remember, in any economy, we need to collect data so that we are able to make informed policy responses. So there is that time lag, the time between the time that you take for policymakers to obtain the necessary data so that we can be able to tell the direction of the economy. That's what we are referring to here as the data lag. We also have the recognition lag. And the recognition lag, as the name itself suggests, it is the time it takes for policymakers to be sure of what the economy, of what the data that has been collected are signaling about the future course of the economy. So it is the time that it takes for the policymakers to recognize what the data is signaling, what the data are signaling about the future course of the economy, the direction of the economy, where it's going. Okay, so that's what we term the recognition lag. It takes time to recognize the direction that the economy is taking, or the signals that are being presented by the data that we've collected. A good example is NBER. This is the National Bureau of Economic Research in America. Will not declare the economy to be in a recession until at least 6 months after it had determined that one has begun. So it's not like when they collect data for South African GDP or consumption expenditure, already we've seen maybe that the consumption levels have fallen in South Africa. We don't rush to announce it now. We have to wait and see what the data is signaling. So that period is a recognition lag. There's also the legislative lag, which represents the time it takes to pass legislation to implement a particular policy. And it exists in most cases for the fiscal policy, because especially in most countries, South Africa included, if there's some sort of democracy, not democracy, but independence on the implementation of the monetary policy. Because remember, we talked about central bank independence, and we said the central bank independence, they've got instrumental independence, because they have the capacity and the power to choose the right instrument to use in achieving a particular goal. So the same applies again. In terms of the implementation of the monetary policy, they have the power, they have the independence to select the tool. So this legislative lag, it exists normally for the fiscal policy, because that's where parliament, okay, those guys in the parliamentarians, they would sit down and then they will discuss about the future of the fiscal policy, taxes, etc. That's the legislative lag. It's the time period it takes to pass a legislation to implement a particular policy. Then we also have the implementation lag, which is the time it takes for policymakers to change policy instruments once they have decided on the new policy. So there is an old policy of 15% VAT, value-added tax, and then policymakers have to sit down and discuss about whether to increase the taxes to 17% or to lower it to 13%. That's the implementation lag. Sorry, it's the time it takes to implement. Okay, if we look at the one that I've explained recently is the legislative lag. Implementation, time it takes to change policy, to say we want to change it from this to this, because now it has already been agreed in parliament. So the implementation lag, time taken to implement. Then the effectiveness lag, it is the time that it takes for the policy to actually have an impact on the economy. You can implement the monetary policy of increasing interest rates or reducing interest rates to 1%. Then the effects would not be instantaneous, like what we have discussed here. You can see those effects maybe after 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. That's the effectiveness lag. Right? So, according to Milton Friedman, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Why is it like that? It is because you can find out that wherever there is inflation, Friedman would link it to changes in money supply. That's why he would say inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Milton Friedman is well known for this saying. So let's look at some of the causes of inflationary monetary policies. If everyone agrees that high inflation is bad for the economy, why do we see so much of it? These are questions. Do government pursue inflationary monetary policies intentionally? It's another question. But we can have answers for that. Number one, there could be a rise in the inflation target. If the government decides to increase the inflation target from a higher rate, then it implies that that can be an inflationary monetary policy. Because now, if you have decided to do that, let's see what would happen to the economy. So if the government has decided to increase the inflation target from pi t to pi t3, pi t1 to pi t3, what does it do? Step number one, it would implement an autonomous monetary policy, okay? Or we can call it a quantitative easing monetary policy, which is an autonomous monetary policy easing, which shifts the aggregate money curve to the right from here to here. And over time, the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts upwards from here to here. And inflation rises and the new to the new higher target, because here they've targeted a higher inflation rate. But by doing that, they have to increase aggregate demand by lowering interest rates, promote spending, investment, etc. Aggregate demand shifts to the right. We establish a new equilibrium at Y2. But at Y2, this is way above the potential and resources are being strained here. What happens? There will be a rise in the cost of production, which shifts now the aggregate supply curve to the left, from 2 to 3. So we're moving from 1 to 2, because this is not sustainable. We are way above potential. And then we can't continue to operate like that. So cost of production will start to rise, shifting the aggregate supply curve to aggregate supply 3, restoring production level, but at a higher inflation target because the government has decided to implement an inflationary, a higher inflation target compared to the one that we have. Why do they do so? Because perhaps they've seen that the inflation target that we have set is too low for business. So let's try to improve it a bit and increase it to another new target. But this also can be a cause of inflation if the government introduces a new inflation target, which is higher than the previous one. So this is the inflation. Okay, this is the inflation target, the explanation for having a rise in the inflation target. Right. Let's look at high employment targets and inflation. The government can also have high employment targets to target high levels of employment. Remember, high levels of employment is low levels of unemployment. So, two types of inflation can result from an activist stabilization policy to promote high employment. So, we are saying inflation is always everywhere a monetary phenomenon. If we agree that inflation is bad, why do the government continue to pursue inflation targets or to pursue, why do government witness high levels of unemployment? There are explanations for that. They may want to increase the inflation targets, or they might be having high employment targets. So there are two types of inflation that result from an activist stabilization policy to promote high employment. Number one, we have the cost push inflation, which results either from a temporary negative supply shock or a push by workers for wage hikes beyond what productivity gains can justify. Remember, in economics, if there is a supply shock, like an increase in oil prices, it affects the cost of production and it pushes inflation upwards. Two, if workers through their unions, they push for high wages or wage hikes that are beyond productivity gains. Because remember, generally in economics, we assume that if we don't want any inflation in the economy, wage increases must be tallied. There should be a tally between the wage increases and the productivity gains. If these two are equal, there won't be inflation. But unjustified wage increases that do not correspond with the productivity increase would lead to inflation. So we can all agree that even at a workplace, if you are a sole trader, and then maybe you hire someone to do some of the logistics, you will find out that you would provide a pay increase if you see there is a productivity increase for that particular person. Otherwise, if there is no productivity increase, there is no reason for you to have a wage increase for that person. Cost push inflation. These are the costs that are pushing prices up. Demand pull inflation results from policymakers pursuing policies that increase aggregate demand. So in this case, it is aggregate demand that is pulling prices. So we must know cost push and demand pull inflation. Let's have some diagrammatical illustrations of cost push inflation. Okay, there's nothing intimidating in this diagram. This is quite simple and interesting. One, the first thing that you need to know in every diagram that you meet in economics is to know where you are starting from. So in this case, we are assuming that we are starting at point number 1, in which aggregate demand 1 and aggregate supply curve 1 interacts at inflation level pi 1 and output level yp, which is our potential. Step number 1, a temporary negative supply shock shifts the short-run aggregate supply curve upwards from AS1 to AS2, establishing a temporary equilibrium at 2 prime or at y prime here. But the government might not watch and see that happening at its watch. What do? Step number 1, step number 2, it causes output to fall and unemployment to increase. We've done that. Step number 3, policymakers increase aggregate demand in response to the supply shock. so that they want to correct output instability here, so that we go back to our potential level. But by doing so, they obviously aggregate demand will shift to AD2 and would establish a new equilibrium at a higher inflation, right? So this process would continue to 2, 3, 4 until we reach a very, very higher level of inflation. So it would lead finally to a spiral rise in inflation. So a cost push or shock, which acts like a temporary negative supply shock, shifts the short-run aggregate supply curve upwards to the left to AS2, and the economy moves to point 2. To keep aggregate output at YP and lower unemployment rate, policymakers shift the aggregate demand curve to AD2, and the economy will return quickly to potential output at point 2 and an inflation rate pi 2. Further upward and leftward shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve to AS3. If there is another shock again, AS3, then the government would also respond, because now we are below equilibrium at this point. Because remember, now we were here. At this point, there is we are below employment, and policymakers would increase aggregate demand. Now we are here. Another shock again will bring us to 4, and then the government will also respond to this by an expansionary monetary policy until we reach inflation rate pi 4 here. So the overall conclusion is that, and so on, would cause policymakers to keep on increasing aggregate demand, leading to a continuing inflation increase, which is what we call a cost push inflation. Any questions on this diagram? It looks complicated, but it is not. Let's move on to demand pull inflation. So on demand pull inflation, it all starts from the policymakers themselves increasing aggregate demand to reach higher output target. We are assuming that, let's suppose that the economy is operating already at its potential level, but these guys, they have a target level that is way above, beyond the potential. So when that happens, they would increase aggregate demand from AD1 to AD2, establishing a temporal equilibrium at 2 prime. So you can see that a too low unemployment target, this is exactly the same as a too high an output target of YT. It's way too high unemployment target. Okay? Sorry, what did I say? It's too low unemployment target, but too high output target. This is just the opposite. It's the same thing, but viewed from a different angle. When you're having too low unemployment, it means that output is very, very high. So we are targeting a very, very high output. Alternatively, we are targeting a very, very low unemployment target. Causes the government to increase aggregate demand, shifting the AD curve rightward from AD1 to AD2 to AD3 and so on. Because the unemployment rate is below the natural rate level, wages will rise in the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift up and leftward from AS1 to AS2 and to AS3 and so on until we reach another inflation level here. So what's the difference here? Cost push inflation, it is a supply shock that causes now government to respond by increasing demand supply or quantitative easing, increasing aggregate demand. Now, when it's a demand pull, it's demand that is pulling prices up. So the result is a continuing rise in inflation known as demand pull inflation. So you should Google and research further on the difference between demand pull and cost push inflation. Any questions on this diagram? No questions. So Let's look at combating inflation. We are almost done with today's lecture. We're almost coming to an end now, but we also want to learn how can we combat inflation in the economy. First, it is important to note that because productivity increases can lead to lower unit cost of production, this can lower also inflation.
Sorry, Doctor.
Yes, thank you.
You said we should research on a demand pull and what?
And cost push inflation.
Oh, cost push inflation. Okay, thank you very much.
All right. Sharp. So we can't say we've studied about inflation when we don't know how to combat it. So we want to look now at some of the policies that can be implemented in order to combat inflation. So first, it is important to note that because productivity increases can lower unit cost of production, these can also lower inflation. So remember, in the economy, if we have improved productivity, if productivity rises, it implies that there will be a reduction in the production costs, which can also result in lower prices charged on goods. And this is beneficial because it would result in reduced inflation. So productivity increases, they are very, very good, especially in lowering inflation. So this can be another way of dealing with inflation. Improving productivity in the economy to lower unit production cost. So these are called supply side measures of combating inflation. So productivity increases, they are on the supply side of policies that combat inflation. So supply side policies, they are aimed at increasing supply, because when there is an increase in productivity, it means that there is an increase in supply in the economy. Let's have an illustration. This is quite interesting. Let's have an illustration here of an economy that is operating previously at this equilibrium, supply and demand. Oh, remember, these are aggregates, not only supply and demand. There's a difference. And you have done that in your microeconomics level too. So let's suppose that this was the P star equilibrium and Q star, and you can call it Y star equilibrium level of output. But the potential output, YP, was here. So there is unemployment because there is an output gap here, which we seek to close. So another way of dealing with that, but at a lower rate of inflation, would be to increase productivity. And when we increase productivity, it means that aggregate supply in the economy would shift to the right, increasing production, but at the same time lowering the price levels. So this is a supply side policy that I'm just illustrating here, because increases in productivity would result in lowering production costs, increasing output that can be produced in the economy using the same resources, increasing output but lowering inflation. I was just illustrating how it works, and I hope this can help you in understanding what is happening. So we are saying these are supply side policy measures. So the better and increased use of technology is also part of this strategy. Another way again of increasing productivity or of combating inflation is to have increased use of technology. When you're having a lot of technology, it can increase the productivity per worker, because now there are new ways, improved ways of producing output, which can also increase supply, which can also lower production costs, which would result in lower prices in the economy. The following counter-inflationary measures are also possible. So these can be used on the supply side, but we also have others that can be used even on the demand side. But generally, these are also measures that can be used as counter-inflationary measures. Price controls, in which the government would come in and say the prices of goods and services must not exceed this range, or it will be a price ceiling. Price controls in the form of price ceilings, trying to contain prices within a certain range. There's also another way of combating inflation, in which a voluntary social contract between business, labor, and government. When these three come together, government would be negotiating with labor and business, or with labor to say, no, don't increase wages unnecessarily that are not justified by increases in productivity. Businesses also, they are also brought on the table to negotiate unnecessary increases in prices. So it's a social contract, right? It's a social fabric that will be existing between business, labor, and government. Because the labor relations, labor unions, they're the ones that push for wage increases. So there's need to be a contract between these three players so that we don't see an unnecessary increase in the price levels. There is also another way, which is a tight monetary policy. Remember, I explained in our previous lecture that there is a difference between an easy monetary policy and a tight monetary policy. A tight monetary policy, we are reducing money supply in the economy. An easy monetary policy, we are doing the opposite. So if it's a tight monetary policy, we are increasing the scarcity of demand in the economy. Okay, it might look like we are using contradicting words here, increasing the scarcity of demand. So in other words, we are just reducing demand in the economy. Because the scarcity of demand, it means there is no demand. So we are increasing that scarcity of demand. So if this is confusing, you can just say aiming at reducing aggregate demand. So these are some of the policies that can be used to combat inflation. Let's look also at the costs of inflation. This is very important, what we are covering now. The cost of inflation. Oh, I thought maybe there's no. Okay, let's do this. The cost of inflation. So inflation damages real productivity when it turns economic agents away from productive activity and productive investment. How does this come into existence? Check this. When there is hyperinflation, guys, if you really understand hyperinflation, when there is hyperinflation, effort will be diverted from productive activities as people would run around and try to protect their own purchasing power. So 2 minutes, you are in the bank, you are withdrawing money, you want to buy something that can help you to keep your money, to keep your value, rather than keeping it in terms of money. When there is hyperinflation, if you just blink, within a second, you'll find out that inflation will be, maybe the prices of goods would have risen by 2% or 5%. You walk into a shop and then you see prices saying, when you walk into the shop, prices were 20 rand, the price of bread was 20 rand. But the moment you walk out of that shop, or when you are at the till, it's already 25 rand or 30 rand. That's inflation or hyperinflation, the extreme case of hyperinflation. So such aspects, they are inconvenient to the economy because now effort will be diverted to protection of purchasing power. People will be running around to make sure that they don't lose anything. So inflation is not good. These are the costs of inflation, but there are also benefits of inflation. You can read on those ones. How beneficial inflation can be to the economy. So inflation has also adverse effects on income distribution, which is important in South Africa. There are 4 main categories of people whose real income is negatively affected by inflation. Group number 1, the first category are those who lack the bargaining power to increase their nominal incomes in accordance with the inflation rate, or else, or even worse, who are on contractually fixed income. If you have a contractually fixed income, it means that whatever happens to inflation, you are still gonna work around with the income that you are having. So your income is not tallied, is not linked to the rate of inflation. Otherwise, if you are not on a contractually fixed income, if inflation rate is rising at 5%, it means that also incomes should also be at par with the level of the rate of inflation. Otherwise, those who do not have bargaining power, they would suffer first. 2, the second category consists of those who hold money because inflation reduces the purchasing power of money. Who are these? These are the people who store their wealth in form of money. If you decide to store your wealth in form of money and there is hyperinflation, there are a lot of people who lose when the economy is in a hyperinflationary environment. Imagine you have stocked your income maybe 5 million rands, and you wanted maybe to invest it later in form of cash. Now hyperinflation comes in. The purchasing power is eroded, and within a month, you won't be able to buy even a house using that 5 million. So these are the second category. This is the second category of people who would lose again due to inflation. 3, the creditors, those who have lent money to others. So if you're a creditor and there is hyperinflation, there are high chances that you will lose in that battle, because you lent someone 1 million today and there was no inflation. Now, due to hyperinflation, maybe 50%, it means 50% of that 1 million will be eroded already, to be gone. And now the lender, the borrower, will only repay the amount that they borrowed from you. So it's you who would lose. 4, the fourth category of people includes all of us, to the extent that inflation causes us to fall into a higher income tax bracket. When there is hyperinflation, in most cases, it would mean that normally some companies, they also pay their workers according to the rate of inflation. So if inflation is going high, is rising, then it means that automatically people will be forced into higher income tax brackets, and will be forced to pay higher income tax. So an inflation rate that is higher than that of our main trading partners can also discourage foreign investment, because the exchange rate will then fall steadily. Those who are doing international finance, you understand that if the rand has gone down, it can discourage investment, especially if it's portfolio or even foreign direct investment, because after investing in South Africa and then you want to repatriate your funds back home, you would now face an exchange rate that is depreciated. Now it means that you have you are making a loss in actual sense, because the profits that you have made here, they will be eroded due to the exchange rate depreciation. But if it had appreciated, then that would be good news for you, because now for every unit of $1, you're now paying less. But depreciation means that for every unit of $1, South Africans have to pay more. Or those who had invested in South Africa, they will be now paying more to change from the rand to the dollar. I hope this makes sense, and it's quite interesting. So these are the costs of inflation, but this is not the end. You can read further and get more of these costs. How does costs affect the business? There's also what they term literally shoe leather cost. Shoe leather cost is the cost of one running up and down to the bank to withdraw their money, because when we are in a hyperinflationary environment, it means that if you were using only 1,000 in a month, you withdraw 1,000 and you know that for the entire month you are okay in terms of paying bills, etc. Now in a hyperinflationary environment, you would need maybe 3,000 or 5,000 or even 10,000 or more. Because remember the relationship between price level and demand. So if prices go up, people will demand more money, and when that happens, it also means that you have to run more up and down to the bank to withdraw money. So literally, they would say there will be shoe leather costs that are associated with that, because your shoe actually would depreciate. If I put it in a literal sense, that's what it means. Shoe leather cost, the cost of the depreciating value of your shoes. Because maybe if you go to the bank more times, then your shoe also will be depreciating. You end up buying another shoe again. So, but it doesn't mean that that's what it means. But the term for that is the shoe leather cost. You can just Google online and say shoe leather cost, and you'll find out that those are costs that are associated with visiting the bank so many times. There are also what they term menu costs. These are costs that are faced by businesses when they are changing price tags. Remember, when it's a hyperinflationary environment, if you're a business, today the price of bread is 20 rand. You put a price tag for that. tomorrow it's 50 rand. You have to change the price tag, put another one. So there are costs that are associated with that as well. And they are referred to as menu cost or menu cost. Any questions as of now? Because we've come to the end of today's lecture. And in our next lecture, we are going to focus on the role of expectations in monetary policy. It's not a long section, and the transmission mechanisms of monetary policy. Then we have completed this module. And now it's the duty of you guys to listen to the videos, to read, to revise, to prepare yourself for the exam. And wish you all the best in this module. Right, let's leave this time for questions, and we can call it a session. Okay, I think that, yes.
To me, I don't have a question, but these 2 units, it was one of the most difficult units to me.
Okay. Yeah, so if that's the case, as it is always be, especially for these learning units that we have covered today, these 2 learning units, what you need is to watch the video again and again, maybe 2 times, so that the first time you read, you watch the video, you'll be taking some notes. Where you don't understand, you ask. Remember, we're always available to respond to questions. But to my surprise, I haven't received any single question from any of, except for today. One person just came up and said, how do I tackle this question? So I don't know, people are understanding, or they have not yet started reading, or what, but there's no time. So it's good to start early. So before the next lesson, please try to watch the video again. I understand that we are under a lot of pressure during this time on our side as an institute, because we are conducting so many classes. So to send the lectures, it could be a problem, but definitely they will be sent. They will be sent, but it might delay, because once this meeting ends, it has to be converted into MP4, and then after that, maybe tomorrow it will be available. But the administration will take care of that, in making sure that everyone gets the link. They get the recording and they listen to it. So you might remind on WhatsApp to say, may I please have the recording? And then maybe you won't get a response, or you might get a late response, but it doesn't mean that you won't get it. Definitely it would come. So my advice to you is that once you get the recording, please watch it, and also try to read from the textbook so that you can understand. Any other questions?